My name's Andrea Keller and I'm a piano player and a composer. I work predominantly with improvised music and I write original music within the jazz box. And I started playing as a young girl. I've always loved music and always wanted to spend my life being a musician. Well, I put together the project Still Night late last year. Well, actually it premiered late last year, but it had been in the making for quite a while. And it's basically a song cycle, a 60-minute song cycle, which uses poetry as the text or the lyric. And all of the poetry is focused on themes of death, loss and grief. And the poets that I chose for the project span from 11th century Japanese to, contemporary Australian and everything in between. And the music is written for a group of jazz musicians, which include Vince Jones on voice and Jan Slater on voice, so there's male and female voice. And then a three-piece instrumental accompaniment ensemble, I suppose, with Julian Wilson playing bass clarinet and tenor saxophone, and Stephen Magnuson on guitar, and myself on piano.
Listen, longing and lost in the struck bells, recurrent calling. No time in which to forget.
Well, the project premiered last year in 2016 here in Melbourne and has done a couple of performances since. Also in Melbourne, we haven't actually played it outside of Melbourne, but after we did the premiere performance, we recorded the music in one day, in a very live setting at the Melbourne Recital Centre in their beautiful salon space. And I've just released that album. So I'm quite excited about that, and it seems to be receiving quite a positive response.
Perhaps if death is kind and there can be returning.
Well, with my music, because I'm very driven and dedicated, I suppose, to creating new music and new projects. It's something that I just find I'm compelled to do, and I'm always really rejuvenated by it and excited, and it's always such a great learning process for me. So I'm always on the lookout for new projects to make and new people that I want to be playing with or working with. And I had started reading poetry as a result of my association with Alan Brown, the great Australian jazz drummer, who was also a poet and had a very deep love of poetry. And over the 15 years that I played with him, he would often share poetry with me and other people on stage and in the audience by reciting poems, and then we would improvise along to them. So through my association with Alan, I started to read poetry. And around the same time as this was all happening, I started to also think about a new project that could use the poetry, this sort of newfound respect, I suppose, for poetry. And I suppose the choice of the theme came from, I suppose, for a long time, I'd had two very significant events in my life. One happened 17 years ago when my father took his own life. And then, how long ago would it have been? About 6 years ago, my husband and I lost our unborn child.
When neither ground is for the feet, nor any path to follow. No map then or guide, nor voice sounding, nor touch of human hand, nor face with glowing flesh, nor lips, nor eyes are in that land.
Also, in between both of those events, we'd gone overseas I'd gone on a tour and we played in Copenhagen. And while we were there, I don't know why we went to this place, but we went to the cemetery there. And I think it was just recommended that it was a really nice place to go. So we went, okay, we'll go to the cemetery. I mean, in Australia, I've never visited a cemetery outside of, you know, a funeral kind of situation. Anyway, so we went to this cemetery and it was absolutely amazing. It was this beautiful garden, like this lush, enormous garden. Trees everywhere, open spaces, and then areas with tombstones and, you know, various gates and famous graves and all that kind of thing. But it was full of people, and it wasn't just people visiting those that had passed. It was young groups of like late teens, early 20s, having kind of study groups and picnics and families, and it was like this really shared space, a really respected space. It was so immaculately cared for and looked after. And I was really taken by it, and I thought, wow, this is a really different view on death to what I've experienced in Australia. Anyway, you know, then with these other losses that I had experienced, I noted that in both instances, I actually felt very isolated from all my friends and community in a way. There were definitely people that came in support of me and my family around these times of loss, but they were very few and far between actually, and people that I felt quite close to just really stayed away, and I was really taken aback by that, actually, really surprised by that. And I can understand how difficult it is in these times, you know, when quite significant losses like this happen. It's really difficult to know how to respond and what to do and what to say and how not to be insensitive, and, you know, we're sort of overly cautious about doing the wrong thing. But I found that this sort of absence, it actually made me feel like my grief was contagious or something, like people didn't want to be around it because they kind of didn't want to be affected by it or something. I suppose I particularly felt that after we lost our unborn child, and it was around a similar time that an absolute tragedy happened in Melbourne, where a young girl, a 4-year-old girl, was mauled to death by a dog in her home, or in her auntie's home. And it might have been, I was actually pregnant with post losing the baby, I was pregnant with our youngest child at the time that this tragedy occurred to this family in Melbourne, and became obsessed with this sort of story and started to research it a lot and went online and read as much as I could about it, trying to understand how it had happened and trying to understand perhaps how this lady was coping. And then I saw just a snippet, like a couple of minutes of news footage where she was sitting, I think, just on a mattress on the floor, but surrounded by these women of her community who were basically talking for her. I don't even recall that she was necessarily speaking. I think they were talking for her, but they were actually sort of propping her up. They were literally surrounding her physically. And that's when I realised that, it's actually this is a very cultural experience of grief that I've had, which is very different to hers. I mean, obviously, you know, nothing can take away the grief, but in terms of the way her community deals with it and approaches her and supports her, it's a very different thing. They actually all rush there, whereas in my experiences I felt quite abandoned. So I felt like that with these experiences and how sort of monumental they were for me, and this realisation that actually it was very heavily linked into culture, my experiences of these losses, I felt like I wanted to try and do something that would address this in a very gentle way. And of course, being a musician, my natural way to do that is through music. So the idea came to me that actually I should write music based on death, grief and loss, and using poetry, this sort of newfound love of poetry, to tie it all in. So then I spent a really long time, like more than 6 months I think, probably 9 months, just reading as much poetry as I could and trying to find poems that I felt were appropriate for this project. And I had quite specific criteria evolved the more I read and the more I thought about it, and I realised that I needed the poetry and the words to not actually be very specific, but just have this feeling, like, you know, quite specific feelings surrounding it, but not to be taken literally. So there are a lot of great poems out there about death and grief and loss, but they might have been too literal or too long, or, you know, there were various aspects of them that just made them not totally suitable for my needs. But I still had a massive long list that I had to slowly whittle down to these 10 poems that I chose in the end for the song cycle. One thing I wanted to acknowledge is that these experiences are very diverse, and people's reactions to these experiences can be diverse, and of course in the course of the long-term course of grieving, there's different stages in that, and so the poems are all, I chose poems that would all address different aspects of that. So some of them are about the fear of death, and then there's one, Dylan Thomas, Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night, which is about fighting death, and then there's Walt Whitman's Darest Thou Now, O Soul, which is kind of approaching death unafraid, and the Sara Teasdale is If Death Is Kind, and it's a really optimistic, beautiful poem. It's, you know, if only we could come back and we'll be dancing down by the sea, and, you know, that just sort of really lovely kind of sentiment. And then there's a Marcel Proust one, which is, I think, really about depression, and, you know, so I tried to make sure that there was a lot of the different facets being represented in the poetry, which then translates, of course, into the music. Or that's, you know, part of my role as the composer, I think, is to translate that into the music.
Perhaps if death is kind and there can be returning.
Favourite's hard to pick. I mean, because sometimes when we do the gigs, I mean, the music is quite composed compared to a lot of the other stuff that I write, which, even though I'm writing for improvisers, often I leave more room for the improvisation, whereas these pieces just turned out, it just seemed more appropriate that they were more composed. But still, when we do them, because there is still some room for improvisation, they can be quite different when we perform them. So sometimes, like at the end of a performance of the whole song cycle, I'll think, oh gee, that one went really well, that's my favourite at the moment. So I don't have an all-time favourite. The Dylan Thomas one, Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. I mean, that's such a powerful poem. And in fact, as part of my research for the project, when I started to get more and more into how to write with text and how to use lyrics, because I hadn't done that extensively beforehand. This was really the first project where I really wrote a whole project surrounding that. So I did a lot of research into it and how to do it, and I spoke to various singers and composers. I did research online, and one thing I realised was that I had a choice with the rhythmic flow and phrasing of the words, whether to go with it or go against it. Then I also realised there can be really individualistic ways of reading those poems, and phrasing them. I mean, even though it's written a certain way on the page, and some poets such as E.E Cummings will really lay out the words in a very specific way, but I don't know whether that necessarily affects the way you would read it. So as part of my research into that rhythmic vocabulary, I went online and tried to search, or I searched for all the poets to see if there was any recordings of them reading their own poems, because I thought if there are, then I'd like to adhere to those rhythmic phrase structures that they use, the way they hear it, and where they hear the emphasis on certain words. And anyway, there was a few that I found. One that really sticks out though is the Dylan Thomas reading "Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night," and he actually sings it. So what I did was I just transcribed his reading of it, and then I turned his reading into a melody and a form. I kind of made it into, it's sort of a little bit of a pop song form. Like, I use that term very loosely. If people study it closely, they'll go, no, it's not. But it sort of sounds like that to me anyway. But when I heard him reading it, it's almost like it was so complete with harmony and everything. I didn't feel like I was really composing that one. It was like he'd actually written it and I was just arranging it for this ensemble. So that one sticks out to me.
Do not go gentle into that night. Great men need death, who see with blinding sight. Blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
The feeling when I'm playing the song cycle, I suppose because we've only performed it 3 times, it's not as though, I mean, I am familiar with it obviously because I lived with it for a long time, writing it and conceiving it and all of that, and rehearsing it and workshopping it. But I'm still very much, when we're performing it, the feeling is still very much about, is everything in the right spot and what happens here and what's coming up next. And, I'm very much sort of doing the job, so to speak. So I'm not particularly emotional in it. Although I must say there's one song, the Walt Whitman text, Darest Thou Now, O Soul, where it's for Gian Slater, it's a feature for her, and it's actually the highest point in the song cycle in terms of register. And she's got quite a massive range actually, and a really high voice, and she goes up to a top B flat, and it never fails to give me goosebumps in that bit. And it's obviously the kind of peak of the work anyway. So yeah, that's a feeling that I kind of, that's an emotional sort of response, I suppose, in that. There's another one, the Marcel Proust one, So Tired of Having Suffered, which is quite free comparatively. Gian's improvising a lot, and even the rest, the bass clarinet and piano improvising. And I think in that one, it's a real search for this really, really expressing this sense of, as the title says, just so tired of having suffered, like just finding that space. So I think because it's very open there, because we can actually really bring ourselves into it through improvisation, then the feelings are stronger. Some really positive responses, which has been fantastic, and I've really appreciated them. Actually, people have been quite generous after we did the first performance, I received a couple of letters and emails, and that was really lovely, and people just relaying some of their stories and some of the really intense situations that they're living with, and how this music has helped them, or, you know, that they even had realisations while listening to it. That and I think one young lady expressed this sort of relief that she was sitting in a room feeling like she was surrounded by people who were sharing and having the same experiences as her. So that idea that she wasn't alone and wasn't really isolated was really important. Well, I certainly know the impact in terms of my skills, which I don't think is what you're really asking me, but the impact on my musical abilities has actually been really significant. Like learning to write for voices and learning to write with text, and the whole researching of the sort of topic and the area that I wanted to work in. I've learnt a lot through that. And even, you know, we live in a sort of a time where musicians and artists really have to sort of take care of their own business, perhaps more so than, you know, than a few decades ago, where there were sort of more people in the industry with jobs to do all the different aspects. Now, especially in what I do, because it's so sort of minority, you know, kind of really not a massively popular art form, jazz and improvised music. So, you know, every project that I do, just doing more and more of that practical stuff around releasing a project and trying to get it out to people, and there's always learning curves in that. Emotionally, it's harder for me to sort of, I don't know, it's harder for me to specify how I've grown through it, but it's definitely provided a sense of healing for me in a way. And I think, like this young woman expressed when she wrote to me, this feeling that we are all in this together, and it is really hard to talk about this stuff, and we feel awkward, and we feel like we're in unfamiliar territory. But for me, I suppose the biggest plus about going through life's hardships is the feeling of empathy and compassion that comes from that. And this feeling that you are getting wiser and you are actually learning some really important lessons. That's really important to me, and, you know, sharing that sense of empathy and compassion, and yeah, including other people in that, that's been a really great thing.
I am a little church, no great cathedral, far from the splendor and squalor of hurrying cities.
I come from quite a small family. My parents were migrants who came out to Australia as adults and left their mothers behind, who were already, you know, slightly elderly. And both my parents had lost their fathers at young ages. And my mother had no siblings. Well, she had one sibling that she never met because that sibling had passed away at a young age. And my father had one sibling who had one son, and her husband had died. So it was sort of I come from a very small family where the families themselves were only ever two parents and one child, but one of the parents, you know, then died. So, and then the fact that I was growing up in Australia just with my two parents and my brother and no extended family that I knew, I suppose when my maternal grandmother died, when I was probably about 10, I think, I'd actually never met her, and this happened overseas. And I remember being really sad because it was actually just before she was meant to come to Australia for 6 weeks. So I was actually going to meet her, and it must have been terribly hard and sad for my mother, particularly having not seen her for a long time, and then you know, this happening just before they were about to be reunited. But that's my only experience of death was her passing, and you know, I remember the moment, and I remember it being sad. I remember how I felt. I think I was too young to kind of really comprehend perhaps how my mother felt at the time, and I don't remember anything really sort of being discussed very much about it after that. So so I was relatively untouched by death and loss throughout my whole childhood. So it wasn't really something that my family needed to broach, I suppose. I think it's really important for us to talk about our death stories and our experiences of loss and grief, because none of us are going to escape it. We're all going to be affected by it in some way, and it's just a way that we can build a greater sense of community, and we can actually help each other, and you know, by sharing our experiences and understanding that no two experiences will be the same. It's kind of like being pregnant and, you know, and becoming a mother. I feel quite similarly about that. Like, it's important to share honestly what your experiences were, but not to expect that someone else's experiences will be the same, and try and be empathetic and learn to listen to what other people's experiences have been, and learn from that. And yeah, I feel like that about death and grief and loss, because I think in those isolating sort of experiences that I had, if I had felt a greater sense of community support, or even felt like I had places to turn, I think it would have maybe eased some of the sort of, well, definitely the feeling of isolation and the feeling of being on the outer. And, you know, I was really lucky. I've got a fantastic husband and I've got 3 beautiful children. I consider myself really lucky and very supportive mother, and, you know, but imagine if I didn't have those things and I was going through these great losses, it could be a really different story for me, you know, or, you know, other people are going through that. So I think it's really important what you guys are doing to actually set up something that is about sharing and support. I've wondered if in my particular circumstances, whether it was that those losses seem to be particularly taboo: suicide and stillbirth, and whether that is why people really couldn't sort of, or were unable to really approach those situations, because it was incredibly, obviously difficult, but very unfamiliar as well. Well, I think by talking about death, we can just gain a greater sense of community, and we can all learn to become more compassionate. And I think I often feel, and I read this in a lot of other people's writings, and whether they're social media posts or articles or whatever, but that we really need to focus on kindness and compassion, and I really believe in that. And I think that's one of the great things about music, is that it is actually an act of generosity to create music. It's not for any other reason, really. It's about expression. It's about trying to express something in a way that can be interpreted very widely, which is the beautiful thing about it, that people can bring themselves to it as listeners. They can bring themselves into the music and grab what they want from it, or things will resonate with different people in different ways. And for me, that's the fantastic thing about it, that it's not one way of understanding it or one way of interpreting it. It's really very open. And so through my music, I think for a long time I've felt like, because of course being a musician, I question why I do this, like why I spend all my days doing this for all these years, and why do I think it's worth it, particularly in a society that doesn't really value arts all that highly, and often is very angry and anti the arts. So it makes me question why I do it, and why I think it's worth me doing this and actually earning a living out of it. And for me, I've sort of realised that actually what I'm trying to do is just create a tiny bit of beauty to put into the world.
His light and proudly his darkness.